Well, good evening, everyone. First, I want to acknowledge the people who are the traditional custodians of the land. We pay respect to the elders, past, present, and future, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples. My name is Christoph Nedupil Wang. I'm the director of the Griffith Asia Institute, and it gives me extremely great pleasure to welcome you here. And it's great to see such a wonderful turnout. I'm absolutely excited to have Dr. Andrew Charlton, sorry about that, my German, speak tonight. And I will introduce him just in a second. Before I introduce him, I want to also really thank the Queensland Gallery of Modern Arts for being such a wonderful partner over the last 18 years already, with hosting the Perspectives Asia for so many years. And in this wonderful venue, we are always very, very excited to be here. So without too much further ado, I really want to kind of share the excitement of having Andrew here. Andrew is a very well-known Australian economist, writer, public policy expert, known for his work in the fields of international trade and development. Many of you will know that he also served as a senior economic advisor to the Australian Prime Minister and has held various roles within the government, and including his current role as elected federal minister for Parramatta. He's also an entrepreneur, so he actually kind of founded and sold, I think, very successfully a company. So I think he really has this breadth of experience. And the funny thing is, when I Googled his name, the name that came up is people also search for Joseph Stiglitz. So I guess everybody knows Joseph Stiglitz, probably a more well-known economist worldwide than Andrew, but I think it shows kind of the similarity between you two, and also kind of the co-authorship of the book that you've done a couple of years ago. So Charlton is not only the author of this very interesting book, which I guess all of you have in your hand already. If you have not, you should get it. Andrew's also agreed to continue signing after this event. He's author of several influential books on economics, globalization, public policy, where he really explores some of the complexities of global trade, also sustainability, which I think is also close to my heart. He's recognized for his insightful analysis of global economic trends and contributions to the public. So this book, Australia's Pivot to India, was launched earlier this year by Prime Minister Albanese. Albanese stated that the book is a thoughtful, warm, and optimistic work that educates us about the past and challenges for the future. Now, Foreign Affairs Minister Penny Wong, who also visited Griffith University back in June, stated that the book is a powerful declaration for the shared future between Australia and India. I read the book. I even paid the full price. You're getting the discount out here. And so I of course want to kind of make sure that it's kind of getting its full kind of praise. I really find it insightful about understanding India-Australia relations. I've only been here for the last 3 months in Australia, so I'm still learning about a lot of the Australia and the world, and including India and relations. So I found it extremely insightful to learn about it, and really impressively easy to read. So it's really enjoyable reading. Andrew shows kind of the history of Australia-India relations from a very personal perspective, but also telling stories about people that he kind of encounters and meets, while mixing this all with an economic perspective as well. And he draws kind of this broader kind of chapters of acquaintances of the early years of Australia-India relations to friends between India and Australia, with the 3 Cs as Commonwealth, cricket, and cuisine, to the 4 Ds of democracy, defense, Dosti, which is friendship, and diaspora, to the latest chapter of the relations of family and partners. Now, a really, really interesting book. So I'm really, really excited to hear your presentation now, and we will have also a time for questions and answers. So very warm welcome to you, Andrew. Thank you so much for being with us here tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Christoph, for that very warm introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the Griffith Asia Institute for the invitation. I also want to thank the GOMA for hosting us. I've never been in this room. It's a really beautiful room inside a really beautiful gallery. So it's a real honour to be here, and I want to thank Tarun and Simon for hosting us. I too want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. My first trip to India 20 years ago was to launch a book that I had written about international trade. As Christoph mentioned, the book that I wrote with Joseph Stiglitz. And when I was there as a young economist, I was struck by the audaciousness of India's post-independence project to build, without possessing much basis for either, a modern industrial economy and an egalitarian democracy. That seemed like a huge task for the nation in the state it was and given the history it had had. And on that first trip to India, I learned something that I previously didn't know about India's economy. Something that revealed my own ignorance about India and its history, but probably also revealed a broader misunderstanding between Australia and India more generally. You see, I, like many Australians, had up to that point thought of India in my mind's eye as a historically poor country, as a developing country, as a country that was on a pathway towards prosperity but had traditionally been poor. And what I discovered on that trip and in subsequent research is that that is not a fair description of India's history. In fact, for more than 1,000 years, between AD 40 and 1750, India was the richest nation in the world, bar none. Not only were they the richest nation in the world, but India accounted for more than 25% of global GDP on its own. At some points, it was as high as 30% of global GDP. India alone in that period was nearly a third of the entire global economy. It had the most sophisticated financial system, the most sophisticated communication system. It had invented modern banking under the Jagat Seth family. Its shipbuilding, textile and armaments industries were the most sophisticated in the world. No less than 25% of all traded merchandise in the world originated and had been manufactured in India. It was a powerhouse of manufacturing, particularly in Bengal. So far from this perception that I had had as a young Australian that India was a historically poor country, in fact, quite the opposite. India had been the richest nation in the world, and it had been so for most of the current era. Each time I went back to India, I learned more, and I became more fascinated by its chaotic national journey from medieval powerhouse to colonial vassal to impecunious republic and to its present incarnation as an emerging superpower. And last year, when I was elected to Parliament, I became the chair of the Parliamentary Friends of India. And at that time, I began a writing project to explore India's growth and its impact on Australia. When I began writing this book, I had a sense that India's relationship with Australia was on a strong trajectory. But I didn't at that point appreciate quite the year that we would have in store for the bilateral relationship. This year, Prime Minister Modi visited Australia. I went to the event that he held in Sydney at Kudos Arena. There were 20,000 people in attendance. And as I stood there in the electric atmosphere of that event, I was trying to rack my brains to think, if this is 20,000 people at a political event in Australia, what's the next largest political event that I'd ever been to? I don't think I got to more than 1,000. When Prime Minister Modi came to Australia this year, he became the first Indian Prime Minister to ever visit Australia twice. And this year, Prime Minister Albanese became the first Australian Prime Minister to visit India twice in 1 year. This year, no less than 12 Australian ministers have travelled to India. That's already a record, and the year isn't out. Now, this unprecedented level of activity is not an accident. And I argue in the book that it reflects the fact that India's role in the world and its importance to Australia is changing perhaps more rapidly than any other country that we have relations with. India's ascendancy at the moment is remarkable. Consider just these three facts. This year, India became the largest nation in the world by population. The last time that title changed hands was at the fall of the Roman Empire. And this year, India recorded, as it has for the last several years, the fastest economic growth of any major nation. Now, India's population growth and economic growth are not just strong, they have a huge runway ahead of them. India's population is so young and growing so quickly that not only are they this year the largest nation in the world, but their growth is so strong that by 2050, India's population will exceed China and the United States combined. By 2070, India may exceed the population of China, the United States, and the European Union combined. So when you combine this with the strong economic growth and you combine it with their very rapidly increasing military capability, and you reach an inescapable conclusion. And that is that for all the twists and turns of India's history, it is coming to a point of remarkable promise. In fact, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that just as the 19th century was ruled by the British Empire and the 20th century was dominated by the United States, on those growth and population projections, we may well end the 21st century with India on top, certainly as a superpower and potentially as a preeminent superpower. But I try and argue in the book that India's rise is not just evident in the numbers, it's also palpable on the streets. Driving, running, selling, begging, cooking, shouting and sitting, there is a sense of anticipation amongst the people of India. In every village, in every city, you can feel the fast-dawning realisation that what happens here will change the world. In the book, I also argue that India's rise will change Australia both inside and out. It will shape our region, shape the geopolitics of the world, but it will also shape Australia internally. Today, the Indian diaspora has blossomed into an extraordinary community numbering more than 1 million Australians. Nearly 1 in 25 Australians has Indian heritage. And Indian Australians are by far the fastest growing ethnic group. Indian Australians recently overtook New Zealanders and Chinese Australians to become the second largest migrant group in Australia, and they will shortly overtake the British to become the largest migrant group. And they're making an enormously positive contribution to Australia and also helping to unlock this incredibly important relationship that we have with one of the world's emerging superpowers. So when you put these two things together, India's growth in the world and the growth of the Indian diaspora in Australia, you reach this inescapable conclusion that is at the centre of the book, that the rise of India will change Australia inside and out. Now, Australia and India's connection is not recent. In fact, we have connections between our two countries that go back as far as time itself. If you travel to the Darling Ranges behind Perth in Western Australia, and you visit the Nilgiri Mountains in South India, you will see common geological features, including striking granite promontories, cliffs and escarpments, because hundreds of millions of years ago, Australia and India were physically connected in the ancient Gondwana land. And those rocky hills in southern India and in Perth, now 6,000 kilometres apart, were once the hinge that joined Australia and India together. And in the many thousands of years since, when First Nations people cared for Australia, there is some archaeological evidence, although it's disputed, that Indigenous Australians had connection with people from the subcontinent. It's claimed that Australia's dingo, which is relatively recent in the archaeological record, first seen around 8,000 years ago, may have been the descendant of an Indian dog brought here around that time. Around that time as well, Indigenous culture changed a lot with the introduction of tools and different practices for cooking and other household activities. Fast forward to colonial times, and India and Australia were very close. The Sydney colony only survived because of its connection to India, which provided food and other supplies. More than a third of all of the ships arriving in New South Wales came from the Indian ports of Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta, as they were then known. In the 19th century and the early 20th century, it's one of my favourite connections, the Australian wool industry was booming, and again, there was an Indian connection. Australia's famous merino sheep was the combination of a number of different types of sheep from around the world bred together into Australia's flock. And one element of that combination was a small number of sheep from India brought here in 1792. These were Bengali Garol sheep. Now, Garol sheep are not attractive animals. They're very small. Their wool is very wiry, but they have one remarkable property: extraordinary fertility. And the probability that a Garol sheep has multiple births is higher than any other sheep in the world. And this small number of Indian sheep bred that fecundity gene into Australia's merino flock, making Australia's sheep flocks prolific breeders, growing our sheep population rapidly. And it's been said that India's famously fertile sheep turbocharged the Australian wool industry. In the 20th century, Australians and Indians fought side by side. In that such an important moment in our history, the Australian campaign at Gallipoli, which is such a big part of Australian identity, known to every Australian, not every Australian knows that Indians and Australians fought together on that battlefield. In fact, more than 15,000 Indians fought beside Australians at Gallipoli. 1,600 Indians lost their lives in actions at Gurkha Bluff, Gully Ravine, and in the climactic attempt to seize the summit of Sari Bair. And again in the Second World War, Australians and Indians fought side by side again. And towards the conclusion of that war, Australia became one of the first nations in the world to diplomatically recognise India. And when India finally gained its independence in 1947, Australia responded very warmly. Australia's Foreign Minister at the time, Herbert Evatt, noted, "Our geographical proximity and our common interest in the affairs of the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia naturally throw our lots closely together." And in the ensuing 8 decades, the desirability of a warm friendship with India has been affirmed and reaffirmed by every Prime Minister of Australia from Chifley to Albanese, motivated by strategic logic, fuelled with cultural enthusiasm, historic connections, commonalities of geography, history and language. We've sought to build a deep relationship with India. Yet, and this is where the story gets interesting for me, yet for most of our joint history, we didn't manage to achieve that warm relationship. In the words of Ian Hall, who's here today, one of Australia's foremost India analysts, Australia's attempts to build a strong relationship have been fitful, but they have not always borne fruit. Indeed, for nearly 6 decades, bilateral relations were characterised by misperception, lack of trust, neglect, missed opportunities, and even hostility. In the 1950s, the relationship had sunk so low that Paul Hasluck, who later became Australia's Minister for External Affairs, described Australia's relationship with India as worse than those of any other country, including Russia. In the 1960s, we clashed over apartheid in South Africa and the war in Vietnam. In the 1970s, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam felt compelled to admit that there was, and I quote, "something missing in the relationship." And the Department of Foreign Affairs concurred that India's importance to Australia was recognised, quote, "perhaps more in the breach than in the observance." In the 1980s, Australian diplomats described a sense of drift in Australia's relationship with India, and a Senate report in the 1990s concluded that the two countries were, quote, "unusually distant in their relations." For many decades, despite that positive start, despite the strategic logic, our common geography, our shared history, too often the relationship seems to have comprised what former diplomat Mark Pearce calls a series of false dawns and first dates. And part of the book tries to answer the question, why? Because by diagnosing the reasons for these failures over many decades, I hope it helps us to design a better relationship with India in the coming decades as it becomes such an important nation in the world and such an important partner for Australia. Now, there's no shortage of introspection on this question. Why was Australia's relationship with India so bad for so long? Described at different times, as I said, as one of the worst bilateral relationships Australia had. How did we let it get so bad? And much has been written on this topic by eminent academics, Ian and his colleagues, by foreign policy experts, by Australian diplomats. And in the book, I look at a few different explanations for why that relationship was so bad. One explanation that gets referred to a lot is to blame the politicians. Now, as a politician, I'm not well disposed to this explanation, but it does get brought up a lot. One of the best quotes in this area is by the great Alan Gingell, who once quipped, "Every Australian government has discovered India once and then promptly forgotten about it." And it's true that leadership and political leadership in particular matters for bilateral relations. It's difficult to disagree with Meg Gurry's assessment that we can trace the origins of Australia's lacklustre relationship with India to Menzies' lack of interest Frank Bongiorno agrees that the imaginative and emotional deficiency in Menzies' engagement with Asia had a chilling effect on regional relationships. And the Labor opposition at the time accused the Menzies government of having missed the opportunity to interpret the new nations to the old world and the old world to the new nations. At different times, Australia's political leaders have discovered India, but there has always been a lack of follow-through. And that's why for such a long period, for so many decades, we failed to build the strong relationship that we should have had. The second common cause of Australia's poor relationship with India that is often cited is bilateral frictions. Just events that occurred that pushed us further apart, that created frictions and unease in the relations. There have been many of these over the decades, and the two common themes that run through our history are race and security. And race has been an issue in the relationship right from British colonisation to the White Australia policy to the terrible incidents of the bashing of Indian students in Melbourne and, unfortunately, many others. Security has been a significant issue in the relationship around India's nuclear testing, around Australia's strong bilateral relationship with the United States, our arms sales at different times to Pakistan. All of these were frictions that were able to distract and derail the relationship at critical times. I argue that while no doubt both of these two explanations, pinning it on bad luck and pinning it on politicians, have some merit, I argue that there's, I think, deeper reasons why Australia failed to build that strong relationship with India. And I'm drawn to what former Foreign Minister Gareth Evans referred to as the concept of ballast in a bilateral relationship. Ballast is what is needed to maintain bilateral communications and continuity when policy agreements break down, or as he put it, when squalls blow up. And I seek to argue in the book that Australia's relationship with India for all those decades lacked ballast. And that's what made us vulnerable to small setbacks becoming big breakdowns in the relationship. It's what made it difficult to provide that political leadership that was enduring and sustained. And for me, and maybe this is just because I'm an economist, I see one of the big failures of ballast in the relationship being the economic relationship between Australia and India, which was, for much of that period, extraordinarily weak. In 1990, an Australian newspaper lamented that nothing has succeeded in prizing open the door to the Indian economy. Despite decades of attempts, our economic relationship seems to be perennially in first gear. And this was a puzzle. In some of these decades, Australia was forging extremely strong relationships with many of our Asian neighbours. We had powerful trading relationships with East Asian countries, but we never built a strong relationship with India. And that failure to build that relationship sucked the ballast from the bilateral relationship. I argue in the book that the reason that we were unable to build that strong economic relationship is because India, for various reasons, just chose a fundamentally different economic model to the economic model that the East Asians pursued. The East Asians pursued an economic growth model which has been described as export-led growth. And that economic model, pursued by Japan and Taiwan and China and many other East Asian countries, was enormously complementary to Australia. The two key features of that model are that they need to import vast amounts of raw materials, to invest in capital, to build factories, to build manufactured goods. Big tick with Australia. We love exporting raw materials. And the second feature of that export-led growth model is that they then export vast amounts of cheap manufactured goods to the rest of the world. Another big tick, Australia loves importing cheap goods from elsewhere. And so we had this roaring, dynamic, deepening economic relationship with these East Asian countries as a result of this very complementary growth model that they were pursuing. India, on the other hand, pursued a different development strategy. They pursued a development strategy which, in the post-war period, was equally popular. A growth strategy which is called import substitution, focusing on self-reliance and poverty reduction rather than trade and investment. The essence of the import substitution model is that countries following that model, rather than looking outwards, they looked inwards. And India tried to build national champions. They raised their tariff walls. They tried to focus their own businesses on serving their vast local market. And that strategy, which has received a lot of criticism in the ensuing decades, although it was much more popular then than it is now, had the unfortunate side effects of not being complementary to Australia's economy. And so Australia had the ballast in the relations with our East Asian neighbours, but didn't have the economic ballast in our relationship with India. There are many reasons why India pursued that model. Part of it was its colonial history, never wanted to be dominated by another nation again, either politically or economically. But it led to a rupture, a schism between Australia and India in economic terms. The second lack of ballast, the deep forces that pushed us apart, were in our geopolitical outlooks. Now, Australia in the post-war period was a multilateralist. We had a deep enthusiasm for alliances, while India believed in neutrality and strategic autonomy. Australia locked itself into alliances with other global powers, which restricted its scope to engage with India on issues of security and geopolitics. Now, we might live in the first empire-free millennium, but the legacy of bygone empires still powerfully shapes our times. India and Australia were both British dominions, but we had very different colonial experiences. And we came out of those colonial experiences with radically different world views as a consequence of our colonial journey. India's experience left it with a profound fear of ever being dominated by another country. This drove anxiety in India and distrust of global superpowers, and India's determination to pursue its interest without joining either of the two Cold War blocs. India's first Prime Minister, Nehru, said, "We do not intend to be the plaything of others." And he became the architect and principal author of India's non-alignment policy. But Australia's imperial history left us with a very different lesson of statecraft. Membership of the British Empire provided Australia with security and prosperity in the first century of European settlement, and our alliance with the United States underpinned our security. As a smaller nation, our safe place has always been nestled into the bosom of a larger power which guarantees our security. If Australia's motivation in foreign policy is fear of abandonment, as some have suggested, India's is fear of subjugation. And these different perspectives, shaped by different colonial experiences, caused us to move in fundamentally different geopolitical directions. India's centuries of oppression and suppression left it suspicious of superpowers and preferring non-hegemonic multilateralism, while Australia's more benign relationship with our colonial ruler left us with a desire to join many different alliances. Now, these four explanations, the lack of political leadership, the setbacks and squalls that created frictions, the lack of economic ballast and the lack of strategic alignment, These 4 explanations for why Australia had a poor relationship with India for most of our history are not mutually exclusive. No doubt they all played a part in shaping the relationship for better or for worse. But as I argue in the book, my bias is a little towards the more fundamental factors, that our relationship just didn't have that central core, that central economic core, that central strategic alignment. And that meant we didn't have the ballast to build a deep and resistant and resilient relationship. As Christoph said, the book is structured in the progression of a relationship. The first section is called Acquaintances, about the era when we were ships in the night. The second section is called Friends, about the era that brought Australia and India gradually, slowly closer together. The third section is called Family, which is about the era of the Indian diaspora in Australia. And the final section looks forward. It's called Partners, about building a relationship that isn't just warm, but is deep and reciprocal. What enabled us to move from acquaintances to friends was a series of events in the 1990s, when over several years, the tide of history began to draw India and Australia closer together. And in the book, I talk specifically about 3 events that would radically change bilateral relations. The first event was the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the USSR, which enabled Australia and India to both rethink our foreign policy. The second was the economic liberalisation of India, an extraordinary story in the 1990s of economic transformation, where a new Prime Minister and Finance Minister, in the grips of an economic crisis, introduced deep and far-reaching economic reforms that unleashed India's economy, grew its middle class, and enabled much stronger engagement with Australia. Moving away from what I described before as that import substitution model, which was fundamentally incompatible with Australia, towards an economy with which we had much more in common. And the third catalyst for change was the beginning and acceleration of migration to Australia from India. Indian migration to Australia grew significantly in the 1990s as a result of changes to migration policy to focus on skilled workers, as well as growing mobility amongst India's middle class and rising educational opportunities. None of these 3 things, dissolution of the USSR, India's economic reforms, or migration, was an overnight change in the relationship. None of them were breakthrough moments, but over time they profoundly changed the bilateral context, like a gradual blossoming of flowers and bearing of fruit from seeds planted many years earlier. As Christoph said, for many years, Australian and Indian diplomats summarised our relationship in terms of the 3 Cs: cricket, Commonwealth, and curry. But over time, this became an overused cliche, betraying a shallow relationship. The 3 Cs gave a semblance of familiarity, but were really a poor substitute for deep and genuine connections in trade, investment, culture, security, and diplomacy. And in recent years, in the book, I talk about the deepening of the relationship across so many other aspects. One that I talk about in the book, although I'm guilty of a cliche in talking about it, is our cricketing relationship. But I do think it's really instructive. The cricketing relationship between Australia and India is one of the things that we've always had in common. But the change in the nature of that cricket relationship is a wonderful microcosm for the broader change in the relationship. You know, both nations have a rich cricketing history, and our matches have generated immense interest and excitement among fans. My son and I are watching the World Cup right now. No doubt we've got some more fascinating matches to come. And this rivalry has brought the people of India and Australia closer together. And it has fostered camaraderie and respect between the 2 nations. But in recent years, the nature of our cricket relationship has changed. Cricket used to be a sport that Australia played against India. Australian cricketers would travel for a test series across the world where the pitches were slow and soft, where the food was risky and the weather was hot. But today, more than a dozen of Australia's best male and female professional cricketers play alongside Indian players in the Indian Premier League, which has been instrumental in bringing cricketers from both countries together. Many Australian coaches and support staff have participated in the IPL, creating friendships and collaborations that extend beyond the cricket field. Today, Australians are just as likely to be playing cricket with Indians as they are against Indians. And this is no more evident than right here on our local cricket pitches in Australia, where Indian migrants and the Indian diaspora have had an enormous contribution to Australian cricket and have a great passion for the sport. When you look at the Cricket Australia database, the database of every cricket player in Australia, every cricket player from the young boys and girls swinging a plastic bat, like my children, right up to the elite players at national level. You look at all those thousands of players registered in Cricket Australia, the most common surname in all of those players is Singh. The second most common name in all those thousands of Australian cricketers, amateurs and professionals, is Smith. The third most common name in all of those Australian players is Patel. The fourth most common name is Jones. You get the picture. Cricket has become something that we don't so much play against Indians as something of a shared passion that binds us together internationally and together in Australia. I'll finish with this. Shortly after he became Australia's High Commissioner to India in 1965, Arthur Tangi sent an agitated note to his Foreign Minister, Paul Hasluck. He arrived in India, as I've alluded to find a listless diplomatic relationship. And he was disturbed by how weak the relationship was and how little traction Australia seemed to have in New Delhi. And the High Commissioner, Arthur Tangi, wrote to his boss, the Foreign Minister. He wrote that while there was fertile ground between the two countries, no one seems to know what seed to plant. Well, today I think we finally know what seed to plant. And that seed is the Australian diaspora. As I said, Australia is now home to more than 1 million people of Indian heritage, nearly 1 in every 25 Australians. They're the fastest growing ethnic group, and the number of Australian people who were born in India has increased 7-fold in the last 2 decades. Nearly a quarter of the 1 million people who arrived in Australia from other parts of the world over the last 5 years were from India. And Indian migrants have had an extraordinarily positive impact on Australia. They love democracy. They're fabulously well qualified. Indian-born residents have much higher levels of educational attainment than all usual residents of Australia. 64% of Indian-born Australians have a bachelor's degree or higher. 64%. That's compared to 26% of all Australian residents. That means Indian-born Australians are more than twice as likely to have a university degree. They're more than twice as likely to have a master's degree or higher. Now, unfortunately, this level of educational attainment isn't fully captured in the Australian labour market. The stereotypes of Indian engineers driving Ubers is not without foundation. Although Indian-born Australians are much more likely to have a degree, they're also much more likely to be working in low-skilled occupations than Australian-born people with degrees. Let me give you this fact. More than half of Indian-born people working as labourers in Australia have a tertiary degree. By comparison, only 4.2% of Australian-born people working as labourers have a degree. It's 50% of Indian-born Australians, 4% of Australians. 46% of Indians working as machinery operators and drivers have a degree compared to 3.4% of Australians born working in the same field. So I argue in the book that the Indian diaspora has an enormous positive contribution to make to Australia, but Australia also has to do its part to lay the foundations so that this new wave of migration is as successful as previous waves. And in the book, I talk about the impact of the Indian diaspora on so many parts of Australian life, from culture to sport to media to faith and religion, indeed into politics. And there's so much energy in Australian politics around the relationship with India at the moment. I was lucky enough to go on the Australia-India youth dialogue trip several years ago, and that was founded by Sean Starr, who's here today. And when Sean founded it, it was a visionary initiative, one of the elements of Australia's soft power supported by DFAT, but Sean had to do a huge amount of work to get it off the ground, to build it. Today, that initiative is such a powerhouse. Hundreds of people applying, a huge amount of attention. And that's just one example of the strength and energy in the Australian relationship politically. Let me finish with this. Australia's relationship with India has never been stronger than it is today. The Albanese Labor government has prioritised our relationship with India. We have so many elements of a strong relationship. We have an annual leaders meeting, we have a free trade agreement in place, we have cooperation in the Quad. But the best thing we have in our relationship, I argue, is the Indian diaspora. The Indian diaspora can help take our relationship to the next level and beyond. They understand India, can help us navigate the complexity of India. They have the connections, the language skills, and the relationships to build our national awareness and ensure that Australia finally creates a strong and real partnership with a nation that will become a preeminent superpower in the 21st century and will shape Australia inside and out. Thanks very much.
We'll have a couple of minutes for questions and answers. Andrew, I think you just want to
Remain.
Stay there.
Shelter in place.
I want to thank you, Andrew. It was such a marvelous, positive outlook on this Australia-India relationship. And not only that, I think it's also very marvelous how we covered really so many different aspects, from actually the long history, even of geological history, to the people's history, to the economy, to geopolitical aspects. So really, really marvelous kind of how you tied everything together. All marvelous how positive it is. And I would be German if everything was positive. Germans are always careful. So you also highlight in your book actually a couple of things that are probably not as positive. You're highlighting how the Lowy Institute finds out how the temperature, how the Australians view Indians is actually decreasing. By now, it's the Australians view India actually at a 62 degree, I think 57 degree. Australians are surprisingly critical, I found. They find the European Union at 62 degrees. So we're shocked about this. We have to do much better. But the United Kingdom is 70 degrees and so on. Trade with India is only $26 billion versus China, 251, so 10 times more with China. So I'm curious, you're talking about ballast and how kind of cricket and the diaspora are two elements of ballast. Trade, I think, also ideally improving. But are there some other things where the ballast can be improved? Whereas particularly India has also been, I think, as you mentioned, a more freely choosing ally. Conflict with Russia and the conflict also kind of working with China, working against China, being part of BRICS Plus, but at the same time being part of the Quad. So can you, what else can we throw under the ballast maybe to make this relationship even stronger?
Yeah, great question, because you're absolutely right. You know, the facts of India's ascent to be the world's most populous nation, one of the largest economies in the world, fastest growing economies, that fact is not lost on any other country as well. And so Australia is in a queue of countries that want to build strong relations with India. And India, by nature of its history and present stance, pursues this policy of what was non-alignment is now multi-alignment, but basically means the same thing, which is be friendly to everybody. So Australia needs to be clear that what we hope for our relationship with India, we're going to have to work for. You know, we want India to be part of building a secure Asia-Pacific region. We want that. We feel that's core to Australia's security in an increasingly challenged world. We want India to be part of Australia's prosperity, giving us an avenue and access to the kind of growth that we previously got from the fast-growing East Asian countries. As their growth starts to slow, that we can participate in India's enormous growth. So we want a lot from India, but so does every other country. So in the book, I argue that we need to build a real partnership. And I don't think that partnership, at least in an economic sense, will look the same as the partnerships we've built with other countries. If we just say, why is India not the same as our relationship with China or Japan or Singapore, I think we'll miss a trick. I think we need to forge a different type of economic relationship with India. And I think that will look a bit different to the things that Australia is used to. We're probably not going to export a huge amount of commodities, although we do export plenty, but probably not on the same scale as we have to the East Asians. We're probably not going to import the same volume of manufactured goods. But take this as a fact of our economic relationship, which is different but significant. If you look at the 4 major banks in Australia, one of them, I won't say which one, employs about 29,000 people in India, headcount of 29,000 people. They employ a bit less than 10,000 directly, as in they are people walking around with, you know, they're formal employees of this bank. And the rest they employ indirectly through TCS, Accenture, DXE, outsourcing companies that are extremely popular in Australia. These are the type of companies that used to, you know, do call centres, but now they do a wide range of activities for Australia's biggest companies. So one bank employs 29,000, another employs 25, another employs just over 20. Some of our telecommunications companies employ a lot. If you go down the ASX 50, you don't have to get very far adding up the number of employees that Australian companies have in India before you get to 500,000. So just think about that. That is 500,000 people in India working to operate Australian companies, working directly for Australian companies, doing the software programming, the outsourced finance, the payroll, in many cases the software development, in some cases the software engineering, all of these functions that have been outsourced. So we have a massive economic connection with India through that. It's not a connection that many of these banks and other organisations like to talk about very much because we have a negative disposition to shipping jobs offshore. But it is a very strong economic relationship and the foundation of a relationship that we can build on. So I just use that as an example. Our relationship, if we just wish a relationship with India similar to the one we have or had with China, I don't think we'll get there. But if we treat India differently and try to build a new type of relationship based on these new features of our economic interdependency, then I think we can have a really strong, robust economic relationship that does have genuine ballast in it, to use Gareth Evans's phrase.
We're running a little bit out of time, but let's select some questions. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I have a very good question. You mentioned about involving the diaspora in a lot of the work you want to do in India. What are some of the things that the government is already doing? Because my research is very much within the Indian space, and there's not as much involvement that the diaspora feels. Like there are things that the government does, but overall, what are some of the specific things that the government is doing?
Yeah, great question.
Shall we take some more?
Sure, yep.
So you spoke about population growth positively, but it comes with a lot of imposition on resources, and as Maxi was trying to make this 200, and he was facing these cracks. Part of it was because he was facing pollution in Mumbai. Pollution is a big problem in the country. So just to add up the population growth, resource consumption, and pollution, and of course climate change impact. Do you have a sense of if there is Australia-India relationship pivoting around climate change, technologies, and so on?
Yep.
Thank you for your very sound presentation of the complexities of the international relationship. As the recent visit with China showed, often the way in which Australia deals with the internal issues of different countries has to be dealt with some subtlety. India has had some issues of late with conflict between the different faiths and different ethnic groups. How might Australia deal with this in a frank but obviously also cautious way?
One more question? Do you have questions?
Yes, I do.
I
was interested in your comparisons with Northeast Asian countries. I have a personal interest in Indonesia, and I found that Indonesia was one where we didn't appear to talk at all. So much of what you said about the Australia-India relationship, delete India, put in Indonesia, they're almost exactly the same relationship. It's been worked on for the last 55 years. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up and down. Is there any difference between the India relationship and the Indonesian one, or are we going to see exactly the same kind of phenomenon?
Interesting.
Well, one more, then yes.
Yeah, you talked about liberalization in India. I think India was a bit late to liberalize the economy. And for example, after liberalization, Tesla was one of the big or giants or contenders there to improve the telecommunications state. And then suddenly Tesla, in fact, been state for some reasons. And secondly, about liberalization, what I am trying to say is, I'm sure the miracle economies of East Asia and Southeast Asia, and among them was Singapore and Hong Kong, those two such a small space or regions. And you will see that huge Indian capital went to those two places. At some point, liberalization took place, and in fact, India also, of course, benefited of it. So, liberalization was a big thing in India. And before that, in terms of politics, I suppose you would say Pakistan and India was always after 57. And And the Indian major interest was the Soviet Union, and Pakistan was China. So that was a major factor why India was in fact was not. Thank you.
Thank you. Great, all good questions. What is the Australian government doing for the diaspora? Look, I think quite a lot. The Australian government just launched the new Centre for Australia-India Relations, which is a nearly $50 million initiative to support the Australian diaspora to promote bilateral relations. The government has taken the largest ever trade delegation to India of diaspora businesses, and I think is rightly focusing on diaspora businesses rather than the ASX 100 in building our economic relationship. I think the ASX 100 have had a pretty poor record of trying to engage with India. That road is paved with failure. Many of the Australian companies that have tried have failed. But if we stop focusing on the big companies and start to focus on the diaspora companies, I think we're going to have a lot more success, and that's certainly been a big part of the economic strategy between the two countries, as well as promoting Indian culture, arts, faith and media. The point about climate change is very well taken. India's enormous population growth is very positive for its economic growth, but it comes with very significant consequences for the environment. Australia and India are working very closely on this. Chris Bowen has met many times with his Indian counterpart, and Australia and India recently, on the Prime Minister's trip to India in September, signed a memorandum of understanding on jointly addressing climate change, which was also a theme of India's G20 presidency. That is a huge challenge, but lots of scope for Australia and India to cooperate. And I think one of the pillars of our future relationship will be cooperation on energy. Certainly, there is a lot of attention on human rights in India and on India's democracy. Of course, Australia should have firm principles about human rights. But we should also acknowledge that India is a very strong democracy, and we're lucky to have it as a strong democracy. It might not be exactly the type of democracy that we want, but it is a strong democracy. And it has done something for the world which I think is incredibly valuable. You know, when I was a student, there was a big debate about whether democracy was compatible with economic development. People said, oh, democracies aren't good at economic development. They can't make the tough decisions. You know, you need a really authoritarian hand to deliver the tough reforms that provide breakout economic growth and lift countries out of poverty. That was a strong school of thought, if not the accepted wisdom, when I was an economics student. And that's a very dangerous school of thought because of its implications for democracy around the world. Well, India's democracy has proved that wrong. India, the largest democracy in the world, delivered strong economic reforms and is now the fastest growing economy in the world. So that message, that democracy is compatible with economic development, and India being that proof point, I think is a great gift to the world that should be recognised. Indonesia, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's sadly a case of Australia too often in our history lavishing attention on the powers of the past rather than trying to build relationships with powers of the future. And we're a little bit slow in pivoting and focusing on that. And Indonesia is probably another case that we will come to wish we had invested more in. And then liberalisation. I mean, I think it's a terrific story. I think it's one of the most inspiring global stories of how strong leadership can transform the fortunes of a nation. And that leadership by Prime Minister Rao and Finance Minister Singh delivered an incredible period of change that led to an incredible period of prosperity that has lifted more people out of poverty than any other nation in the world. That's the speed round finished. I think we might be out of time, but thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Simon Elliott. I'm the Deputy Director, and it's a real pleasure to have everyone here for what is the very last of our series this year of Perspective Asias. I'd like to give a vote of thanks to our speaker, who has got a really busy schedule, and we're really pleased and honoured to have him here and have an hour of your time. So I'd like to thank very much Dr. Andrew Charlton, MP, the member for Parramatta. What you gave us of an insight into the long history of India has been quite extraordinary, certainly for me. And, I think as Christoph started, a very personal approach and a historical approach. And Andrew, we don't actually have that many economists who come and talk in art galleries, but I certainly wasn't, and we need more. But I certainly wasn't expecting to, learn about the fertility of sheep in your conversation. That was eye-opening in many ways. But look, and I think your point, and someone made it here. What's fantastic about Perspective Asia is we talk from Australian perspectives about our perspective into Asia, and your conversation has shown yet the many trip-ups that we've had in relation to India. Could be Indonesia, could be in many countries in the region. Thank heavens we have Griffith University, thank heavens we have Perspective Asia series to talk about the common denominator in all those relationships, which of course is us, and how we think about the world and our place in the world. And that's something that this country's got to keep on working on. And I hope maybe you'll come back in 5 years' time, Andrew, and it won't be the pivot to India, it'll be the embeddedness of India perhaps, and Asia in total. So I mentioned that this is the last of the series. The team is cooking up for next year, which will be released in the new year. And in terms of that team, I just really like to warmly acknowledge the contribution to Professor Christoph Netapil Wang, who of course did the opening remarks today, and his team with Kelsey and Megan for making this Perspective Asia happening here today, and of course Tarun Nagesh, our curator, and also our team here that have been hosting you. So it's fantastic. Now Andrew has said he's going to sign some more books. That's still on the gas. Fantastic. So look, please join with me in thanking Dr. Andrew Charlton for coming and giving us this last one. And stay tuned for next year. Thanks so much.